for being here. So it's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, Richard Milligan. He's a nature society geographer whose research on the intersections of race and colonialism with environmental issues contributes to scholarship on political ecology, environmental justice, and water governance. He is assistant professor in the Department of Geosciences and an affiliate of the Urban Studies Institute at Georgia State University. He earned his PhD in geography at the University of Georgia. His recent publications address water infrastructure, urban hydrology, and water quality in Georgia, racism, climate justice, sea level rise, and political geographies of resource extraction on indigenous territories in Canada. His work in Atlanta investigates environmental injustice in watersheds through collaborative and participatory research with communities and environmental organizations. Current collaborations combine critical physical geography and hydrosocial frameworks to better understand the relationships between racial segregation and infrastructure mediated flows of water and waste. His research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Atlanta Regional Commission, and the Atlanta Global Research and Education Collaborative. He serves on the board of the South River Watershed Alliance, co-authored the Chattahoochee Riverlands study for a 100-mile greenway transecting Metro Atlanta, and co-leads a partnership between Georgia State University, Spelman College, and community-based organizations to develop water quality monitoring network for downstream communities from Metro Atlanta. So we're pleased to welcome via Zoom here, Dr. Richard Milligan.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for that introduction. That was very kind of you. And I'm really disappointed I can't be there with y'all in person. I had a house guest over the weekend who ended up getting sick and testing positive for COVID. And he actually was in town to give colloquium, a similar kind of talk at our department. And 2 people from that event that I organized have gotten sick. So I couldn't in good conscience come down there at this time, and I really appreciate y'all still letting me talk via Zoom. And it's really a disappointment, but nonetheless, let me try to share my screen here.
Yep, looks good.
Thank you. Let me get this. Still good?
Yep.
Okay. Well, yeah, so today I want to talk about racism in watersheds and the pursuit of environmental justice from my work here in Atlanta. And just broadly, I'm really honored to be here with the Sustainability Forum, but you know, I think that
there is a fire emergency in the building. You are to leave the building by the nearest exit or exit stairway. Do not use the elevators.
Richard, we're gonna hit
There is
pause.
a fire emergency in the building.
This
You are
is
to
really
leave
happening.
the building by the nearest exit or exit stairway.
all right, y'all be safe.
I will call you on the phone. Anytime you're ready.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah. Thank you all again. I guess I've got something in here I'm going to say that's just cursed because I got exposed to COVID and y'all had a fire alarm. But yeah, I'm going to talk about racism in watersheds and people pushing for environmental justice here in Atlanta. And you know, the overarching question I had is, what are we trying to sustain? Are we trying to sustain a system that's fundamentally unequal, that just drives more and more inequality and is fundamentally unsustainable globally and locally, and sustains some little portions of the environment or some aspects of the environment, take off the worst edges of that system, or are we trying to sustain something else that would require fundamentally transforming that global system? So that's the kind of perspective I come from thinking about sustainability and environmental justice. And I got here because I love rivers, really. I grew up down 2 hours south of y'all in Coffee County and had a couple of teachers that got me out on rivers, paddling and appreciating the natural world, and learning a little bit about environmental impacts of different sorts. And after doing my bachelor's degrees at University of Georgia, I actually paddled with some friends from Milledgeville all the way to the ocean the summer of my last year in college up there. And several of us were really moved to actually make that a vocation. So we organized this thing called the Georgia River Survey, where we were planning to paddle all the rivers in Georgia, but we only did about 7, the navigable links by canoe, and conducted like an old school 18th century style natural history survey. So up in the top right there, that's the bird boat. My friend Brian Noose is logging every bird that he hears as he paddles down the river. We go 10 miles a day and take turns in the bird boat. We all got trained to where we could identify the birds in the riparian environments of Georgia and do that. And then we camp on the side of the river, and in the morning get up and do a bird point count with the dawn song, and then spend about 5 or 6 hours doing intense vegetation surveys of the riparian environment at each of our points. So we did that over a period of 5 years in the breeding bird season, May, June, July, on the Savannah, the Oconee, the Okmulgee, the Altamaha, the Satilla, the Flint, the Etowah rivers in Georgia. And we would love to pass the torch if you know anybody who would be interested in that kind of work. So building from that, I got involved with organizations like the Altamaha Riverkeeper, the Georgia River Network, the Upper Oconee Watershed Network up in Athens, doing work with other people to try to protect rivers and streams. And there's a lot of folks involved in that. It's a really impressive movement. But what I found doing that work was that, it was like kind of one of the most segregated aspects of my life. So there just was not any representation of the people that I grew up with in the Black Belt in Georgia. It became more and more of a concern for me. So, how does this kind of organizing end up having so little diversity? And I think this data is a little dated. I did my research on this problem from 2012 to 2016. And at that time, there were very few kind of diversity, equity initiatives in mainstream environmental groups that I work with. But I think more recently that's taken off. So, but one thing that I heard again and again in interviews is that, it's like something about the other people who aren't here that makes them not involved. Like they got too much to worry about. They got too much to do. They don't have enough resources. They don't have enough time, all sorts of things. There's this unfortunate separation from African Americans in the environment. And there was almost never an answer that was like, well, the way we do this is actually exclusive or exclusionary in some way. So if you're interested in that point, Carolyn Finney's Black Faces, White Spaces does a lot of really good work to sort of undo the kind of prejudice and stereotypes of somehow African Americans are not connected to the outdoors or to the environment, or not invested in it. It's that the way that we do environmental organizing has this long tradition of being indeed a very white thing. And so I think that the implications of that are very profound. So the discourses of environment that we have are not only exclusionary in terms of how we address environmental problems, but actually they reinforce social injustice from colonialism, from racism, from the inequalities driven by capitalism. So there's a book about race, nature, and the historical geographies of whiteness in Canada that I have a chapter in that goes through that sort of broader impact of the way environmental politics and the way we talk about caring about the environment actually reinforces broader social inequalities and power relations. But today I'm going to talk about environmental justice, and Dr. Womack already talked about the origins of it coming out of Black churches and the civil rights movement. So the Toxic Waste and Race report from the United Church of Christ in 1987 really is a landmark study showing this correspondence of toxic pollution with racialized communities, particularly African American communities in the Black Belt and across the Southeast. And Bob Bullard's book, Dumping in Dixie, that she mentioned, is basically a must read. Everybody ought to check that out if you can find the time. The library probably has several copies of the different editions. But the kind of research that I do on environmental justice is like, you know, it's not just the disparities, the disproportionate exposure to environmental harms and risks. It's also the exclusion from environmental affairs. And it's also, importantly, not something that happens just because of some villains making some racially motivated decisions. It's not just about siting facilities in marginalized communities, low-income communities, indigenous communities. I mean, it is that, but not only. And in fact, the way to think about it, if you ask me, is that, you know, through and through, our social environmental processes are interconnected, and the power relations of society as a whole are creating these long-term processes that structure systemic exposure of the most marginalized in our society to the harms that come from the environment. So again, as Dr. Womack emphasized, across the U.S., race is the strongest correlation in terms of a demographic characteristic with living near a toxic site or a toxic release, and that is true in Atlanta as well. So the Green Law put out a patterns of pollution report in 2012, and they showed this, among other variables like linguistic isolation or speaking a language other than English at home, poverty and vacant housing, but race is the strongest correlation in Atlanta. Interestingly, that report, you know, they say like water is too complicated to actually include in this analysis. So the upstream, downstream, the flowing nature of exposure to pollution and waste and dangerous things by water makes it hard to say, because it's not exactly how close you live to it. Because if you live over the ridge, it's not flowing downstream to your house. But if you live quite far away, but downstream, it rains a lot and it pushes it down. So, you know, my dissertation work was all about the Altamaha River Basin, which y'all are in the middle of in Milledgeville. As you can see from this map on the left, my friend Dean Hardy at the University of South Carolina helped me make, or he really made it. You know, that the flow of the Altamaha River system is all through a highly racially diverse and differentiated landscape. But like I said, the organizations and the hundreds and even maybe thousands of people who are out there trying to do advocacy for this river system don't reflect that diversity. And I mean, it's an amazing river system. It's the third largest flow of fresh water into the Atlantic. And below the dam y'all have there, and then the one just south of here in Juliet, Georgia, there's no more dams or anything. So this is a relatively unregulated, unimpounded basin. And the flows down on the Altamaha and the lower Altamaha are, you know, wild and free to an extent. So there's tons of investment to buy up all the land and put it into conservation on the Altamaha. And it really is beautiful and amazingly ecologically rich and diverse, and the coast, of course. But if you look into how people advocate for that, they're absolutely leaving out the urban headwaters of this river system in their imagination of this amazing, powerful river. So yeah, where I'm at now is up in that top northwest corner of the whole basin. It's where I teach at Georgia State and where I live also, just on the subcontinental divide there. So I've been working with folks to think about segregation and water. So thinking about socio-ecological segregation or socio-environmental segregation through watersheds. So you can use the HUC 12 scale of watersheds. So you have a kind of similar scale of watersheds for the whole country. You can get that data set and match it, pair it to the density of the metro area, so the statistically dense area of the Atlanta metro, and you come up with about 232 watersheds. And then you can use a segregation index to look at segregation and match it not to the demographic boundaries, but to the watershed boundaries. It's more complicated than I know how to do, but I've been working with some folks who are more skilled at this kind of technical work than I am. And, you know, we use this mixed metro approach to thinking about segregation that highlights how, you know, segregation and diversity aren't just sort of polar opposites. You can have increasing segregation and increasing diversity at the same time. And Atlanta absolutely reflects that if you look at its watersheds. So the dark orange color is in 1990, if you look on the left here, is like majority white, very little diversity. So watersheds. And you can see over time, they shift to that peach color. So if you're white living in Atlanta over the past 30 years, you know, your community most likely has kind of gotten more diverse than it was. It's less homogeneously white, right? Also over that time scale, you start to see a few high, you know, moderately diverse, but majority Latinx or Latino watersheds emerge. And then it goes from 0 to like 5 high diversity, no majority group watersheds. So the story people often tell about Atlanta, who are like boosters, who want like the California movie companies to come, who want, you know, Microsoft to come and set up, is like, wow, this is a rapidly diversifying region. And it certainly is. But from the perspective of, am I an African-American living in a segregated watershed, what you see is around Atlanta's diversifying, but actually there's becoming more and more highly segregated majority Black watersheds. So they've gone from just steadily increased over this time scale. And you can see also the majority Black and somewhat diverse watersheds are also increasing spatially and in number across that kind of south portion of the inner core of the metro area. So what does it mean to live in a highly segregated watershed as a minority in Atlanta? And it's not good. The correspondence of race and watersheds unfortunately also comes with a bunch of degradations and flows that are unhealthy from upstream coming down through your community. So this is the upper South River. You can see the color line that W.E.B. Du Bois talked about as the most important problem of the 20th century, and I would argue continues to be for us here in Georgia. It kind of really nicely, you know, falls right along the watershed boundary for this portion, which is not quite 500,000 people, 87% Black. You can see that much of the white population is speckled in there right along the subcontinental divide at the top of the ridge. So the flows coming down from like right in the center of Atlanta. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Here's where I am right now at Georgia State University. The flows coming from here and from where the river starts in East Point, Atlanta, just accumulate a bunch of toxins. And everybody I interview, whether they're environmental justice organizers or not, if they're engineers with the county, whatever, they say this is this has to be one of the most degraded and impacted watersheds in the state. I think Brunswick, Georgia is also quite impacted. But part of the deal is that all the things that you're getting exposed to are coming from the very top of the watershed. And so you might have heard, you know, the solution to pollution is dilution. There's not much dilution happening here. So you have these very concentrated flows flowing out through what's one of the largest African-American suburbs in the United States. And it's growing. So in that same sort of census period that I showed on that segregation map, Atlanta has surpassed Chicago as the second city, as people say, the second largest African-American population in the country, with New York being the first, as it is in most everything. Another watershed that's also highly impacted and also starts right in downtown Atlanta is what's known here as the West Atlanta watershed. That's actually Three Creeks, Proctor, Sandy, and Utoy, but it's kind of similar neighborhoods across that area, and that's where the Atlanta University Center is, with Morehouse and Spelman. And it also starts right here at like the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, if you've ever been, and flows out towards the Chattahoochee River. So these are highly segregated watersheds, and they're the site of tremendous environmental injustice. So the unattributed quotes throughout this presentation are folks that I've interviewed over the years. And one thing that happens is when you talk about environmental problems like water pollution, you know, all of a sudden it becomes human and environment, and that diversity of human and the diversity of experience doesn't show up. And there's this kind of constant refrain in the interviews and discussions I have with people about people not wanting to acknowledge that and not wanting to recognize how basically everything about our city has been shaped and developed over the years through this highly racialized processes. And Proctor Creek has this tremendous amount of sewage flowing through it. It's been remedied some, but people have the strong experience that, you can't go out and play in these creeks. It's not safe. And the South River also has those, but another problem that people face in both these watersheds is urban flooding from inadequate stormwater infrastructure. And that's not just that people lose their lives in the floods. They do. It also damages property and property values, and leads to mold and other kinds of problems that exacerbate asthma issues. And these same watershed, these same areas of Atlanta, if you go on the EPA's EJ screen tool and look at demographics and exposure to air pollution, they're highly impacted by the interstate infrastructure. So going through the heart of this map, you have Interstate 75, 85, and Interstate 20. And then you have Interstate 285 kind of encircling this area. And then the world's busiest airport right here. So how did African Americans come to be concentrated in this like sort of worst position in terms of downstream from the central city of Atlanta? And people have been thinking about this for a long time. Du Bois was talking about it over 100 years ago. He had students going out and looking at how the conditions African American communities faced. And one of the most profound things going on, and I've heard he actually lost one of his own children to this, was exposure to waterborne disease because there was no sewage infrastructure. And the African American communities were people who had been fleeing violence and terrorism in rural areas and came to Atlanta and did not have wealth or power and were facing violence. I mean, they were contained within the least desirable areas, which were the bottoms, as people call them. Buttermilk Bottom is a famous big African American community, early community here in Atlanta that was just downstream and downhill of all the other development and waste collected there. And people didn't have access to piped water, so they had wells. Where we sit geologically, we don't have deep wells, so those wells were tainted with the waste. And Atlanta had some of the highest death rates of any city in the United States at that time. And Du Bois wrote about it very powerfully. There's a picture here from Elmore's Environmental History of Hydrology and Residential Segregation in Atlanta, showing Shermantown, another important community. And you can kind of see the big houses up on the hill, and then African-American community just down the hill. And so, if you look at like American apartheid, like classic text on segregation in the US, Atlanta compared to Boston at this time, looking at a sort of spatial spread, doesn't seem as segregated. And it's because it wasn't segregated in big, stark spatial ways where people live far apart from one another or across boundaries, but instead topographically. And so white and black people live near to one another as the crow flies, but up and downhill. Over time, that changed. So the segregation here became much more structured and driven by policies and other kind of practices. And as that change happened, they started to put in sewerage infrastructure, but what they chose to put in was combined sewers, which, if you hadn't heard about it before, it's where the rainwater that goes in the drains and the ditches ultimately goes into a pipe that has the toilet water going into it as well. So you have one pipe underneath, right here where I'm at right now, underneath the street. It's one pipe, and the rainwater goes in it, and also all the waste, the sanitary wastewater goes in it. So today, in modern times, when it's dry, like today, that sewage is not enough to overflow. It gets eventually routed, as on the left here, to a sewage treatment plant. But whenever it rains, that huge volume of rainwater is too much for the whole system to handle. And so it overflows into a creek or a river. And in the 1930s, as they started having a lot more racially restrictive zoning, they also were installing these giant pipes to try to carry these wastes away. Interesting, the first racial segregation ordinance was actually publicly health driven. So the white supremacists and segregationists who advocated for Georgia's first, Atlanta's first racially restrictive zoning ordinance were saying that it was the African Americans, the black communities were the ones that were the cause of the disease. And so they needed more spatially distributed segregation put in law to protect white people from the disease in black communities, when in fact, it was the white community's waste flowing into black communities that was causing them to die at higher rates. So, you know, throughout the 1930s, 40s, there's a really booming working class and middle class African Americans in Atlanta, and that the several kind of stages of zoning and policies around segregation concentrated them in areas that were continuing to be impacted by these combined sewer overflows. And this is a picture from the 50s with Hartsfield touring as national news for Life magazine, Buttermilk Bottom, and looking at the conditions people face in these bottoms. And you know, the story here in this photograph is he's surveying it in order for them to decide to bulldoze it, right, and clear people out of there. So with the redlining that Dr. Womack talked about earlier, and racially restrictive covenants, and multiple urban processes that drove the shifting segregation patterns, there also was this installation of giant infrastructure projects that from our interstate system. And you can see here in the 50s, there's a dense neighborhood with tree canopy, and today it's this huge network of interstates. It's kind of upsetting. But not only were those urban renewal projects oftentimes about Black removal from the city intentionally, so displacing people, but what they ended up doing was twofold, further driving this kind of coordination of exposure to risks from the watershed, and coordination of that with race. So like the infrastructure is segregation infrastructure, and that it allowed a huge white flight out of Atlanta into the suburbs. So the interstates allow people to move farther away, avoid the integration that was being pushed by the civil rights movement, and still be able to come into the city on the interstates. So it's not just Atlanta as this ugly, sprawling city that was so environmentally unsound and unsustainable. It was actually, that was a racial project. It was invested in at the federal, state, and local level to allow white people to avoid being forced to actually do desegregation. And that infrastructure, all that concrete, actually really compounds this combined sewage problem, right? Because it's not just how much rain falls, it's how fast it gets to that sewer system. So if none of it soaks into the ground, you know, the velocity is super high. So not only was it interstates, there's the Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, which became Turner Field, now it's Georgia State Stadium, and all the parking lots around that also just destroyed a bunch of communities and displaced tons of people. But it's all upstream in the headwaters of the South River, and we still have this today. This is a diagram from the Entrenchment Creek One Water Management Task Force showing the combined sewer lines that still flow down from over a century ago into predominantly African American neighborhoods, and they overflow, and the problem is exacerbated by this infrastructure and development. So you have the combined sewer overflows. You also have just regular, so some sanitary sewer systems. So it's not combined, but it's not enough capacity. And so it will get old, it will break and leak, but also it's just not expanded. And so sometimes there's too much sewage. Water, when it rains, it's not supposed to go in there, but it leaks into it and causes too much volume, and it'll just shoot out of the manholes around here. And we have this happen in my neighborhood, and we have it happen here where I work at Georgia State. So sewage problems are profound. And then there's also the white flight. So 1 out of every 2 white people between the height of the civil rights movement in 1975 left the city of Atlanta for the northern white flight suburbs. With that movement, there's also capital flight, and Dr. Womack talked about it brilliantly earlier. You know, and that movement of capital means there's not a grocery store, there's not a bank, there's not a lot of essential services, but it means there's also not revenues to actually keep up with basic stormwater infrastructure to prevent flooding from all this construction and all these roads and all this impervious surface. So people in these communities deal with sewage overflows flowing through their neighborhoods, but also a disproportionate amount of urban flooding. And especially in 2002 and 2009, again, there was really profound flooding here in Atlanta. And it's funny, if you talk to white folks, a lot of them don't remember. And if you talk to African Americans from the city, it was a lot more profound event. And so a lot of people think, well, flooding, it just happens to everyone. It's kind of a natural event, but no. Neil Debbage piece from 2019, studying the Charlanta mega region, everywhere from Charlotte all the way down to Atlanta, if you're poor, you're more likely to be at risk to have this kind of flooding or to live in a flood zone. But if you're a racial minority or an ethnic minority, you're way more likely to be at risk. So there is a coordination, again, of race and exposure to flood risk. In the Charlanta region, it's been proven, and people are finding this in cities across the United States. You see Six Flags down there, and also this interstate infrastructure completely washed out from that flood. So just going back to the upper South River watershed, we have these two different combined sewer overflow facilities. Let me get my little pointer here. In East Point, Atlanta, you have, so this is the airport where there's no data down here, the world's busiest airport. North of it is a bunch of industrial sites and former industrial sites. So they are all leaching through the groundwater, heavy metals, toxins that flow and pulse down through this area, which outside of 285 here, you have gated communities. These are affluent communities sometimes. I mean, it's mixed, there's pockets of poverty, but this is a huge growing Black suburb with people who are doing well in life in a lot of ways, and yet they're still being having to deal with this kind of injustice. So more than income and more than poverty in a metro space like Atlanta, race is determining who gets this disadvantage, this unfairness. And it's really upsetting. So when I was first starting to do this work, they put in a parking lot and a really nice like walking biking trail down on the lower on the South River in the lower part of the watershed I was just showing. And the local community Crossroads newspaper ran a story with these images on the top showing how people were using that parking lot to then go down and play on the awesome beach right below Panola Shoals down there, and sort of celebrating this July afternoon. And a week later they had to run a story that's like, oh no, it's not safe. And the county, rather than apologizing for its contribution to sewage spills that make it not safe, they came out and put up police tape and put up the sign saying, if you come recreate here, we're going to prosecute you. And it's not only that if you live in a suburb up on the north side in the white flight suburbs, you're upstream of these kind of impacts, and living near the river is like a tremendous boon to your property value. Whereas down here, it's actually people in some of these gated communities will plant hedgerows to hide the fact that their property is on the South River, because it's known that it has waste and is of concern. So it actually could, in some people's minds, it actually degrades their property value to live by the river. But also once it becomes kind of known and is something to be addressed, it's handled completely differently. This is a perspective that has enraged a lot of people. So a couple years later, 2012, the South River Watershed Alliance held this workshop trying to think about environmental justice. And that's actually where the Patterns of Pollution report was first presented, sort of unveiled. And it was a great workshop, but at the same time, there was a lot of despair. There was a lot of anger. Like there was a sense that this is just what's going to happen to us, and they're not going to fix it. And so despite like sort of the math of like showing the disparities and the casework of showing the examples of how this is unfair, it was like, they're not going to do anything. We don't have the power to actually make them change this. And so for the past 10 years, I've been talking to people about that kind of problem. And I've had a paper come out last year on sort of the trap of recognition that can happen with environmental injustice. So, as one person I interviewed said, they'll recognize you all day long, right? But they're not going to actually do what it takes. The folks at the EPA just want to tie us up in conference calls and recognize us, but all they're going to give us are a pittance of what, a tiny amount, when what's needed is this massive investment in infrastructure and overhaul of these systems. So for an example, like the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper sued in the 90s the city of Atlanta for all of its combined sewer flows into the Chattahoochee, and it led to a consent decree. And even though the Department of Justice, the judge who was in charge, the Environmental Protection Agency, Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, City of Atlanta, all acknowledged that this combined system was a disaster in terms of unfairly burdening the Black communities of Atlanta. They all recognize that, but they all also refuse to let the money that was spent to fix the problem be spent in such a way as to address the inequality. They said it has to only address the environmental problem, and what are the best environmental solutions, that's the priority. The only way that the disparity in the environmental injustice was addressed was through the supplemental environmental projects, which is like maybe a couple $100,000. So buying up, like the city being forced to buy land and put it in conservation in some of these highly and disproportionately impacted communities. But the amount that they spent to sort of try to reduce the amount of mine sewage overflows was, by last tally I've seen in the Atlanta Journal and Constitution, was $4 billion that Atlanta has spent since in the past 20 or so years. And part of that is building these giant underground storage tunnels that you could drive a semi through, where all that combined stormwater and wastewater just sits down underneath me right here when there's too much of it. But they did not make that huge investment in a way that would rectify the environmental injustice. Another sort of way that this kind of recognition trap happens is that, you know, they see that, like, okay, there's this injustice, we recognize that, but it also, what comes with that is basically, it's already ruined. And so we can just ruin more. We can heap ruin on ruin because it's already a waste, right? And so you can see that on this convoluted sewer system map here, which I don't know anybody yet who's able to fully understand it, but it shows this complicated mix of sanitary sewers that are separated and then the combined sewers that starts right here where I'm at Georgia State University. And then there's this swooping dotted line that comes in and it says Flint River Force Main. And what that is all the wastewater from the world's busiest airport and College Park and the other neighborhoods right by that airport, which are actually in a whole different watershed. It's in the Flint River Basin. That water is going towards the Gulf of Mexico. South River, rain here is going down to the Atlantic. They pump all of that toilets being flushed, all the wastewater from that whole area over the subcontinental divide into the most highly impacted watershed in the state, or one of them, where there's already this mess of sewage infrastructure and there's already this huge, disproportionate, unfair impact on the most concentrated, largest African-American populations in the state and probably in the Southeast, right? Along with that consent decree process, you know, there's moratoriums in certain parts of the city where the sewer system is separated, you know, disproportionately in white areas of Atlanta, on building new facilities that would add more toilets and shower drains and stuff to the sewer system, because they have meters that they had to install, part of that $4 billion, and a dynamic model that shows dry and wet weather conditions. Can we actually have more sewage here, or will that cause a problem? And so if you're a developer doing some brand new glossy building, which there's a ton of here, it's one of the fastest gentrifying cities in the country, and you can't be derailed by a 1-2 year delay, where if there's a random moratorium that comes up and they have to expand the sewer capacity, you're actually being directed into the very top of the South River Watershed, where it's a combined area, because their logic is like, well, it's the huge volume of rainwater that causes the overflow. There's never enough toilet water to actually cause the overflow, so we can have as many toilets as we want. So there's unlimited open season development in this worst, most impacted upper watershed. So the recognition might get you a small grant to do a little community project, but it doesn't get you the ability to direct the $4 billion to rectify these huge infrastructure problems. And actually, it also means that they're even heaping more waste and degradation on you. So that's not just me saying that, that's me participatory work with a bunch of organizations and people who've taken out their time to speak with me and do interviews over a long time now. And so the organizers who are struggling for environmental justice here in Atlanta are very aware of that kind of trap as they negotiate with the government, with the federal government, with the state, with their city and local officials. So another paper had come out last year kind of talks about some of the strategies that these kind of organizations use to kind of, the way we talk about it is like improvise, like ingenious strategies to say like, okay, I'm negotiating with you, but actually you think I'm talking this way, but I'm actually gonna flip the script and make you do something different. So one thing that's happened is they put up those signs like, you'll be prosecuted if you go on the river. So I started going out with folks in 2012. We used to take several trips a year since then out on the South River from that very spot. And up on the first trip, the CEO of DeKalb County was like, no, you can't take people on that river. Y'all cannot canoe. And we were like, well, we are going to. And I mean, it's when the water's high, I would not go out there. All the wastes are coming when it's been raining and the water's high. When the water's more moderate and low, it's still something of a risk, but it's basically, I wouldn't swim there, but I'll go out canoeing and try to avoid contact with the water, and I'll wash my hands before I eat. And we share that kind of sort of risk assessment and best practices with folks, and we go at good times. But yeah, so the inaugural paddle, they were saying, you can't. And then we were out there, and then the CEO of DeKalb County came out, and he didn't go on the trip with us, but he sat in a boat for a second and had a picture taken by the newspaper and everything. And so it kind of flipped the script on DeKalb County to where instead of them saying, no, y'all just have to deal with this and don't make it a problem for us by getting sick, they started to sort of change their tone a little bit. The Atlanta Watershed Learning Network is led by Eco Action here in Atlanta. It's amazing. It gets people from communities that are in these impacted areas from all walks of life who don't have the insane amount of like specific knowledge and vocabulary and terminology that you need to even just start getting the city to hear you when you say, hey, it's always flooding in our neighborhood. Why is this happening to us? Or, hey, this sewage just keeps backing up. So they have cohorts of students who are, they're in the Learning Network program for, it's usually a few months at a time, kind of weekly meetings. And I got to go and help teach that last summer. And I was just amazed. They had like hundreds of people from the Peoplestown Summerhill community there who were celebrating the youth that had just passed through the program. And it's just like this huge community group of people who all have gotten this training about how to think and talk about the impacts that they're facing. So that's another innovative strategy that I've witnessed and been fortunate to be part of. And then one last one is the Proctor Creek Stewardship Council, which, I've heard from colleagues out in California and environmental justice organizers out there that's like, we haven't had a seat at the table. You finally get a seat at the table and you find out you're still on the menu, right? And so what I've seen happen with the Proctor Creek Stewardship Council is that they've just started having their own meetings all the time and really being adamant and persevere and try to force the city to actually say, what are y'all gonna do about this? And their meetings have become like, I'm a professor at Georgia State, if I want to go talk to somebody from the Department of Watershed Management, the Georgia Environmental Protection Division, EPA, probably the easiest way I can like get a hold of them is just show up at the Proctor Creek Stewardship Council meeting, because they have reset a table to where all those entities feel like they better come and be at those meetings and hear what people are saying. And so this is a really interesting strategy, and I think it's had really profound impacts, and it's been a big win. And then, one quote here, we don't need you to be a savior. We don't want to be a token. We don't want to be your sort of diversity initiative. We want you to come in and collaborate with us and actually listen before you come in. And so even though my work is much more sort of on the sort of political theory side of thinking about environmental justice, I've been trying to do that with some colleagues, Christine Stauber and Sarah Ledford and others here at Georgia State. And a paper came out this year, showcases some of this work, but basically we've mimicked a EPA approved way of measuring E. coli, which is an indicator species of human waste and a dangerous thing in our waterways. And we set up a lab just like the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper at Georgia State and at Spelman College to where we can get basically legally valid numbers on E. coli levels. So students go out in the morning and they collect samples all over the upper South River Watershed. We're trying to extend it into the upper Flint River Watershed as well. And then they come back in the afternoon and you have to put the samples through a process and incubate them. And then the next day you can read off the E. coli levels. And because it's kind of a sharper measure, the community-based groups can take these numbers and go straight to the city and say, hey, we've noticed this high level of E. coli. You have a sewage leak problem. You need to go out there and find it. And there's other programs, like I had Adopt a Stream when I was in high school even, and I've been quality what is it, quality assured, quality controlled, sort of certified again and again over the years to do that. But it's not quite the same legal threshold as this one that we're able to provide with our university lab equipment, and also with the students who get trained and can run the lab procedures. So we have this collaboration going on, and it's been really exciting. And certainly if any of y'all are interested in a master's degree working on these kind of issues, we have a water sciences track here at Georgia State for our master's program, and we've got a lot of students getting involved in this work. So we've been interrupted and everything's taken so long, so I'm gonna stop now. One thing that I was gonna end on was just gentrification, green gentrification, environmental gentrification. So once these communities finally have the investments to fix the problem, what you see is it's not for us, people will say. So it's like you finally fix the problem, and because the place has been so devalued and degraded to where property values are low, speculative real estate development just swoops in. And so as soon as the stormwater or the sewage problems are fixed, all of a sudden gentrification happens, and the people who have lived there for so long dealing with the problem are now displaced once there is a addressing the problem. So all the stuff I shared was thanks to a bunch of amazing organizations that have let me be involved and taken time with me, and a long list of collaborators who worked on various pieces of the stuff that I shared. So I am going to stop there. Thank you all so much. Happy to talk.
Oh, come on up. Now you get to ask the first question. Okay, let's get the microphone on. Check. No, let's use the microphone.
Okay, hello. My name is Elizabeth. I'm from Powder Springs, and my local senator is Senator Tippins, and he's very old, and I don't agree with him on most things. But I went and sat in his office and asked him to bring MARTA to Marietta, and especially with the Brave Stadium and everything. And he's like, no, we're not going to do that. And I was frustrated by that because I really it'd be ideal for me to move back to Marietta. I digress. What do you think about MARTA development spreading outside of Atlanta in terms of sustainability, especially with these watersheds? And do you see that being a positive or a negative or a multifaceted thing?
That's really good. That's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, it kind of goes with how I think about things, where it's like, there's a way that I was first introduced to caring about the fact that MARTA doesn't go out to the suburbs in Atlanta, which was from a strictly environmentalist perspective, but that's dumb for the environment, right? And it's kind of like I remember in the late 2000s, there was an urban planner who would come and do tours, sprawl city tours of Atlanta, as this is what's wrong with America and why it's such an unsustainable society. Look at these, and it was basically look at these idiots who are doing this bad thing, right? And left out of that conversation was that it's actually racism, right? So the fear mongering and the rejection of the expansion of mass transit out into the suburbs is very similar in kind to what drove the spread of the city out into the suburbs originally. It's that people don't want the folks who use MARTA to be able to come in and out of their communities. So it's not just that our socio-environmental relations heap the slow violence of environmental racism into some people of color and low-income people. It's also that racism is so deeply ingrained in our society that it totally gets in the way of things that would be much more sustainable, right? So I think it's both of those at the same time. And I mean, the environmental justice movement coming out of the civil rights movement and organized strongly in Black churches, that's addressing mostly the former, but I try to kind of expand that lens, I guess, and think about how much ruin we're doing towards the environment out of sort of the racism in our society, the structural and systemic racism in our society. So in terms of how it affects water things, yeah, they keep expanding these interstates because the MARTA doesn't go out there, right? So ironically, they put in these reversible toll lanes on interstates here in Atlanta. And my colleague got a huge grant from the Department of Transportation, the Georgia Georgia DOT, to study the environmental justice implications of that. Which, you know, it's hard to understand how they really are framing environmental justice with that opportunity. But what's more happening is that there's at the federal level, they're saying, you need to think about environmental justice. And they're like, okay, we'll do it. Right. But it's kind of incoherent to me. So it's a social justice issue in that those reversible toll lanes allow for some of these folks out in these majority Black suburbs to more easily commute into the city, which is a major economic opportunity. But on the flip side, you know, the growing expansive impervious surface is really bad for watersheds, right? And the communities that are downstream in those watersheds that deal with those impacts are majority African Americans. So there's like a tautology or like some kind of weird mix up to me in how that whole thing has been framed. I don't know if that answers your question very well, but those are very interesting thoughts for me. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Dr. Timberlake. Let's get another question from the strong audience we have here. Yes. Yes. Here we are.
Okay, hey, my name is Nicole. I'm currently in an environmental education class, and one thing we always really talk about is how getting children exposed to like the outdoors young helps like foster this care for the environment and the willingness to like help later on. Do you think there might be some kind of racial disparity to go along with that, like with the South River where they immediately like banned people from going to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, absolutely. So I think Doug's been part of the Paddle Georgia trips with Georgia River Network as well. And, you know, one thing that I've really appreciated about the South River paddle trips is that, you know, they're similar in a lot of ways to getting out there, recreating as a sort of gateway drug to caring and doing conservation work. The strategy is very similar to, how Georgia River Network and other organizations like that, you know, get people out there to get them involved. But it's also really different. So when I go on Paddle Georgia, I'm like, oh, my gear, is this like a good REI thing, or is it like a bad one? You know, like I feel like there's like this little bit of competition, like of the cool people with the good gear and know what they're doing. And it's very much about like sort of like the you know, it's not quite mountain climbing risk, but it's a little bit about like I'm out here struggling, surviving, like doing this outdoor thing with this like risk to it that makes it exciting. And I think that when the paddle trips are organized by, you know, a Black-led organization and they're in a majority Black space and it's urban and the people there are much different, a much wider range and much more reflect the diversity of Georgia and of Atlanta, all of a sudden that whole vibe kind of changes to where it's perfectly cool to be like, I mean, one of those pictures of the two women doing the high five, you know, the feeling is like, this is hilarious that we're doing this. I can't believe we're actually going canoeing. There's a lot more novices and newcomers who come out and do it. And there's just a lot more sort of time spent like being okay with going slow and taking our time. And yeah, for me, with all these years of paddling experience with different kinds of groups, it's always with the South River Watershed Alliance, it's always like a really different thing. So I think that it's not just about like, sometimes I've had colleagues and friends like get like a inner city Girl Scout troop to come out so we can expose more people from the inner city to, you know, the great outdoors. But it's in the big Paddle Georgia environment. You know, I felt like those have been, I mean, this is just, you know, subjective how I saw it going on, like less powerful in the way that you're asking about than these trips that are more sort of like from within the community organized and more sort of, I don't know, I get not just diverse in people, but diverse in like how you're thinking about and how you're enjoying and feeling like it's valuable to be out there doing the recreation. So, you know, they actually hired Rue Mapp at Georgia River Network out in Oakland to do social media posts and blog posts and podcasts, I think, about encouraging more African Americans to get out on the water and do paddling and things like that. And sort of thought about some of the reasons why, but it kind of, in my view, it kind of fell into that little bit of like, the problem is with the people who don't go out in nature versus the problem is like how we like very easily fall into these kind of REI style ways of being in the natural environment. And one thing that's not considered is that people have different kinds of risk when they go out into some bottom land in the country part of Georgia, like where I started paddling when I was growing up. Like in 9th grade in biology class, the older kids, there was a bunch of 10th graders and they're like, you're going to come out to the river this weekend? And the river was the place where we could get away from the law, right? It's where you could, as teenagers, do things that weren't allowed because nobody was down there. Nobody's going to come around or whatever. And if you think about the kinds of racial violence, the history of racial violence that we've had in Georgia, and you think about places in Georgia where that kind of would be something to be concerned about today, absolutely, you know, the rivers where I grew up are absolutely places where lynching happened, and where if you were with your friend who was Black, you would be feeling concerned maybe being down there. So there's a bunch of factors going into that, but it's a really good question. I think it's something we need to continue thinking about and working on.
Well, Dr. Milligan, that was a very complex response to what was a great question, and I think
I thought about it a lot. Yeah.
I think you took it a little further than I had. I was thinking the same thing, Nicole. That was a great question about how we normalize exposure to the outside world for people who are growing up in an environment that isn't safe to be exposed in. So I grew up on the Milligan River in Macon, and so the South River is the watershed for the river that I grew up on and went to when I was a child. And we swam in it freely because we weren't thinking about the complex world at the headwaters.
Yeah.
And one of my questions was, as I travel around different parts of the United States, I frequently see signs at the creek crossing that it tells you what watershed you're in. Have those signs gone up in the South River watershed?
Yeah, there's a couple that have. We need more of them up higher up, like up closer to the central city. Most recently, a new sign went in on the Flint River above the airport. So the Flint River rises just right at almost at the same spot as the South River, but it goes to the Gulf of Mexico, or it goes down and hits the Chattahoochee and forms the Apalachicola. And I mean, it's basically a ditch, and then it goes into a giant pipe underneath the airport. They actually just like maybe a month or two ago put a sign up there over that ditch saying, you know, this is the Flint River. And that's due to a bunch of work from the Flint River Keeper and an organization called Finding the Flint that's trying to sort of say like, wait a minute, we've denied the fact this is a river and degraded it so much and hidden it basically from view so much, and we need to sort of rethink that and bring it back to the surface and make it something that's like a feature of people's lives that they can care about rather than something that's buried away in these culverts and so forth. But yeah, that definitely is an agenda item. What along those lines, Jackie Eccles, the president of South River Watershed Alliance, has been working doggedly to get a canoe trail, a water trail on the South River. And some of those downstream, like DeKalb County, Rockdale County, Henry County, have bought in, and we have a bunch of infrastructure going in so that you can actually launch your boat, not just off the sandy bank there, but from a little bit of, you know, modest infrastructure. And so that's, you know, we do all these trips, so it's going to increase access, but more than that, she's very directly using it to say, okay, state of Georgia, you need to designate this as a recreational water, which will mean that there's a higher threshold. Like you have to have even less E. coli in that water for it to meet the federal standards of the Clean Water Act. So we're recreating, she's got us out there recreating on purpose in order to push the issue, get this water trail, push the issue, and force the state to require a higher level. It's not meeting the standards currently, but there is going to be even more not meeting the standards if we can get it designated as recreational, not just for fishing. So, yeah.
You make a good point that I think 60% of Georgia's surface waterways are not meeting the fishable and swimmable criteria.
Right.
And citizens let the state get away with that.
Yep.
Let's get one more question for Dr. Milligan, please, from our fantastic audience that we have here at the
Thank you guys so much for being with me so late and remote like this.
Hey, my name is Jefferson Collins. I'm a junior here at school. I was wondering about gentrification, and whenever people talk about it, it's like whenever you clean up an area, it sounds good, but then there's a bad side to it that it kicks out the low-income people there.
Mm-hmm.
Ways that we can like increase value and make places better without kicking out the people that live there, because based on like market value, if you raise the value of something, people want to raise the price. So how do we do that?
Yeah, it's huge. It's a great question. It's a huge problem. There's a book that's gotten a lot of play recently. It's popular. It's very smart, called Just Green Enough. I don't know if I agree with it, but it's got some really good thoughts on this, right? And it's like, well, you can't just come in and clean it all up and make it shiny and bright all at once. You have to incrementally do it along with housing policy. Otherwise, it's going to lead to this kind of green gentrification. This is looking specifically at cleaning up environmental pollution and problems like the sewage here in Atlanta. You know, I've got a piece that we're revising to resubmit with Nataki Osborne-Jelks, who is, you know, co-founded the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance 20 years ago, and she's a professor at Spelman. And, you know, I mean, basically there's the Beltline, if you've been to Atlanta recently, is this really popular path they put in. You know, I think we're 4th fastest gentrifying city in the country, and then the most intense gentrification is happening right along that green space that they put in along the Beltline, right? And so the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance has done a bunch of work to like do smaller like parks and stormwater projects at like a kind of neighborhood scale, where they've done things to require that people from the community are being actually employed to do the upkeep and some of the work to establish the park, that there's a coordinated housing policy, that there's community engagement all along the process, and various kind of protections to prevent it being like this kind of instant gentrification investment by the city. But that work, when you look at it at a bigger scale investment, is hard to replicate. And so our paper, we're trying to talk about ways that you could kind of scale up some of the successes that they've had on the west side with Katherine Johnson Memorial Park and Lindsay Street Park, to these bigger projects that are, you know, millions of dollars getting invested by the city. But, you know, one of the former mayoral candidates here at a forum by Trees Atlanta, you know, was like, basically there's global real estate speculation money, like from London, from Saudi Arabia, from all over the world, that's sitting there, and there's really smart people, and they're looking at Atlanta and saying, look at how degraded it is. Look at how devalued this area is, but where do we choose to buy up all the housing? And as soon as there's something with a large dollar sign that the city says it's going to do, that's basically like a trigger for these like giant investment firms to direct their capital there and buy it up. So the forces that we're working against with this kind of problem, it's a brilliant question. It's a really important question. And I think there's a lot of people trying to answer it, but don't know the answer. The forces are huge. They're like global, right? And the ability to get the different silos of like the city of Atlanta, from their water planning office to their housing office to their urban planning office, is really challenging to get them to do something integrated, like that could somehow do, you know, remedying the problems, addressing the environmental problems, but also doing syncopated, like coordinated housing policy with that. That's like really challenging. There's not a lot of good examples so far of people being able to do that. Great questions.
Yeah, fantastic question, Jefferson. Because you see how you have to protect the rights of the local landowners before the investment firms swoop in, or else they're not going to realize their capital. Dr. Milligan, we appreciate the time that you've spent with us today. I know we have learned a lot, both from your panel discussion and your keynote. We do hope to get you back in person when time allows, because we're trying to build an environmental justice focus here at Georgia College. We think we have
amazing.
And we just want you to get familiar with us because we like to collaborate. We are in the same watershed, as it turns out. So
Yep.
you're upstream from us, so we drink your piss, so to speak. Thought I'd just throw that one out. We also have Athens, urine in our water supply, so sorts of psychotropic chemicals involved there. Let's give a warm, rousing welcome and thank you for that. And just a big thank you to Dr. Mortality for being on our discussion and for this being a spectacular organizer. Let's give her a big thank you. I'll send you a picture of the lovely buffet that we'll put some in the freezer for you. Thank you again. I hope we'll be in touch again soon.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for organizing and bearing with me, and I really enjoyed it, y'all.
We're glad you're healthy. I'm sure it's going to work out well. All right, talk to you again soon. Bye-bye. And goodbye, everybody. Thank you. Stick around. We're going to package up some of the food for our friends. Don't worry.